In this Path of Exile 2 video, we're going to be taking a look at the Sorceress class, how the Sorceress plays, what makes the Sorceress different from other classes. This is a guide for new players that are looking to play the Sorceress or struggling with their Sorceress. It is not an advanced build guide or a specific build guide or anything like that. The whole point of this video is to help show you the ins and outs of what makes a Sorceress and how to be successful when using one. So talking a little bit about the Sorceress, the main focus of this class is elemental damage, cold, fire, and lightning, and also the status effects related to those three damage types, namely shock, ignite, and frozen or freeze. Ignite applies a damage over time to a target that is based off the damage dealt by the hit done to that target. So the higher damage you hit an enemy with when you trigger ignite, the more damage over time they're going to take. Additionally, the higher fire damage you do to an enemy with a chance to ignite is going to increase the chances to ignite that enemy. So you want to be doing very high fire damage in order to not only have a better chance to ignite, but also to ignite more often. Shock makes it so that an enemy takes 20% increased damage, and it works kind of similarly to ignite in that when you have higher damage lightning or higher lightning damage, it's going to increase the chance for shock to trigger on the enemy. It's not going to make the enemy take more damage, but it will increase your chance of shocking. This means skills like Spark or something like that that have a lower damage overall are going to have a lower chance to shock than something that has a higher lightning damage. And lastly, Freeze makes it so that an enemy is frozen in place and cannot move or do anything for 4 seconds. Unlike Shock or Ignite that have a chance to trigger on enemies, Freeze builds up on the enemy over time until they're frozen and can be applied via various skills that deal cold damage. So mastering these status effects and these damage types is what playing a Sorceress is all about, and you can either use all 3 of these damage types, which you'll see in some of my gameplay, or you can specialize in 1 damage type and focus on that, or maybe just use 2 damage types. Doing that and these things is what really is going to make your Sorceress unique to you. So the Sorceress class begins at the very top in the middle of the passive skill tree, and they can focus immediately on spell damage or energy shield, and also mana regen or cast speed. Sorceresses will need all of these to succeed, but I usually begin with spell damage to start, and energy shield and cast speed are good secondary pickups, especially if you just slide over and pick up pure energy after taking the practice signs and the other 2 nodes next to it. This can be really quick and get you a good energy shield node and also some cast speed. From here, you'll have options to improve specific damage types and ailments, and you can either pick 1 to focus on, or you can take all 3 of these. I recommend when you're first starting out as a Sorceress that you probably just fill out this little cluster and take all for fire, lightning, and cold damage, simply because you're going to want to play around with these skills at the beginning and see what you like, and you can always respec later on if you find yourself not using a particular damage type. And then if you head left from here, you can take cast speed, or you can get energy shield and armor, and you can also get chaos damage. Chaos damage is useful early if you've picked up any occult spells from the occult skill gems. This is typically what a witch would use, but you can also use them on your Sorceress if you want. And above that, you can focus on different elements which bypass resistances, or you can focus on increasing your damage when you've set many ailments on enemies, which is great if you're focusing on kind of like a tri-damage Sorceress. If you head right instead of left, you can pick up some more generally good nodes that benefit all different damage types, for instance, crit damage and spell damage, which benefit pretty much everything, as well as elemental damage in general, which again will benefit all 3 of these types. And beyond that, there's also a node cluster for a chance for extra projectiles when cast, which is particularly good if you find yourself using projectile spells like Frostbolt, Firebolt, etc., or maybe some of the occult spells that do chaos damage. Additionally, there's another chaos damage cluster here if you did take those occult spells, and to the left you can also increase your AoE size, which is great if you find yourself using AoE spells. The main stat of Sorceresses is Intelligence, which gives them mana, which is great for casting spells so they don't run out, and this also allows them to use elemental skill gems as well as occult skill gems, so they can mix and match these if they want. They can even pick up minions if they want, or if you want to mix in chaos damage. Sorcerers, unlike witches though, are a lot squishier than them, and that's particularly because they don't have minions by default, but they can get minions, and the way that you would do this if you're playing a Sorceress would be to take some occult spells or skill gems that have minions, and to use a scepter in your offhand and a wand in your main hand, kind of like a witch would use, and then, cast your elemental skills or elemental spells while summoning. Now, just because intelligence is your main stat doesn't mean that some points in strength and dexterity are bad. This will allow you to use different skill gems from Strength and Dexterity, which you will need for some of your spells because Strength typically has ones that benefit fire, while Dexterity has ones that benefit lightning. So if you're using fire, you're going to find yourself using more Strength gems, and if you're using lightning, you're going to find yourself using more Dexterity gems. And I highly recommend having, between 20 to 25 Strength as well if you find yourself dying a lot, because the sorceresses are so squishy. This would allow you to use some armor that also has armor and energy shield stats on it instead of just energy shield or energy shield and evasion. Because when you are playing as a sorceress and you have energy shield up, you're fine. But once it goes down, you really don't have any protection and you're paper thin. And by taking some armor that has armor and energy shield on it, you're going to be able to resist some of that damage after your energy shield goes down until it recharges, which will make you less squishy and help keep you alive. Weapon-wise, you'll either use a staff or you'll use a wand and focus, or if you wanted the minions, you would use a wand and scepter. But what you want to look for on these is you want to look for spell damage. This is going to increase all your spells as a whole that deal damage, so that's great. Cast speed is also very good to cast spells more quickly, so ideally, you'd have both of those on your equipment. Beyond that, you're going to want to look for things that further increase damage, like plus percentage lightning damage, or plus percentage fire damage, or maybe +2 to fire skills or cold skills or something like this, because this will further impact your skills. And what you should consider doing is maybe you have one staff that has a lot of damage for fire skills and another staff that has a lot of damage for cold skills, where you can slot one staff in one slot and one in the other, and then map the skills, corresponding skills to those, so that when you cast spells with those staves, they deal more damage because of their buffs. So next, let's take a look at the skills. The first one is Spark. Spark is kind of your bread and butter skill early on, very early on in the game. It flies around the screen all over the place, hitting many enemies. It goes in all directions, so you don't have to really aim it. It makes it really great. However, the damage of it doesn't scale really well, and you'll start noticing over time that it's not killing enemies as quickly. And usually what you need to do is start casting this either through Flame Wall or inside Orb of Storms in order to keep up with enemies. And I like the projectile speed on this one in order for the little lightning things to get across the screen more quickly. And shock chance is also not bad because, as I mentioned earlier, as you have more lightning damage, your shock chance increases, but Spark deals very low lightning damage. So by putting shock chance on it, you can increase your shock chance more often, which increases the damage that these enemies take. Next is Flame Wall. Flame Wall casts a wall of flame at the target location that does fire damage and also ignites. On top of this, projectiles that you cast through the wall add fire damage and can also ignite from fire damage, making it a deadly combo with Spark and Frostbolt if you're using either of these spells. I like to use increased duration on it though, because it doesn't last very long by default, and I like them sometimes to throw up multiple firewalls, so this is really good. And it also has kind of a longer cast time, so you definitely don't want to be spamming it regularly, like too often, and that can reduce the amount of time that you're spamming it. And there also is a skill gem that makes it so your firewall casts in a circle, but it lowers the damage of the skill in general. But what's great about it is it not only protects you if you're standing inside of it, making enemies walk through that firewall to get to you or stand inside of it. If you cast sparks from inside of it, it will make sure that fire damage is added to all of your sparks, because sparks goes in every single direction, and sometimes if your firewall is not in the right place, it's not going through your firewall, but when you have a complete circle around you, it's very easy to make sure you're adding that fire damage. Frostbomb is a great way to deal cold damage at range in an AoE. It has a very fast cast time in my opinion, and I like to throw this one out immediately when I spot enemies if I'm using it in order to get some damage into them and some freeze build-up. And sometimes I'll throw it on hard to kill enemies like bosses and elites that are right next to me just to keep that freeze pressure on them and damage on them while I'm kind of dancing around them. It's really good. I like to add either AoE size to it so it hits more enemies, or freeze build-up in order to make it build more freeze up. Next is Ice Nova. This is just not a great skill in my opinion. I rarely use it when I'm playing a sorcerer. It has a longer cast time. It can be hard to aim properly, and by the time enemies have gotten that close to you, you should probably be dodging out of the way or you're going to have trouble anyway. Next is Orb of Storms. This is a great lightning damage AoE that sends out chains of lightning, sending out more over time, as well as each time you cast a lightning skill inside its AoE. And this pairs particularly nicely with Spark, which casts quickly and you can stand inside it and Firewall simultaneously and use Spark, so you're going to be checking out extra lightning at the same time while they all go through the Firewall, which is really nice. I like AoE size for this one because if you're not using Frostbomb, this is a really good choice to put that on. Next is Frostbolt. This allows you to fire off frozen orbs at range that freeze enemies and deal damage, exploding when they hit terrain. This skill is excellent for freezing enemies, and it can deal extra damage if you cast it through the Firewall, which is another benefit of Firewall. Even if you're playing like a Frost build, it just gets you extra chance to deal more damage and ignite on enemies. I like to use this with Scatter Shot in order to cast 3 orbs at the same time, or you could use increased freeze buildup to freeze more, or cast speed in order to fling out more orbs more quickly. Solar Orb is a great fire AoE that works somewhat similarly to Frost Bomb, but it sets Ignite instead of freezing enemies, and it can also be used at range and has a pretty fast cast time. So again, if you're playing like the fire route, I like leading off with that one, and then sometimes if enemies and elites or like bosses get close to me, I'll drop it on top of them as well in order so they're just like taking that damage while I'm dancing around them. And AoE size is a good one to add for this for support skill gems as well, so it hits more enemies. Next is Cold Snap. This is used to detonate frozen enemies for cold damage. Pairs greatly with Frostbolt early on and Frost Bomb, but its radius is small, and in my opinion, you should either try and make that radius large enough that it's actually hitting lots of enemies by like really expanding its radius, or you should not worry about the radius, try and get more increased damage from support gems, and worry about just killing the target outright that you're hitting with it, because the skill casts very quickly that you can spam it real quick. So I would go either way on that. And just a note here as well that you can detonate Frostbolts mid-flight, which is a great strategy with this skill. I think slowing down projectile of Frostbolt is pretty much ideal for doing this if you want to do it, so consider putting that on Frostbolt if you want to use this strategy. But it can be kind of hard to do, particularly for me, like on controller when there's lots of enemies. Sometimes it just targets the enemies in front of the Frostbolt, so I wouldn't recommend doing this all the time. And when it comes to like the buffs, you can get the persistent buffs that use Spirit for Sorceress. You really have 2 options early on, in my opinion. You're either going to use probably Arctic Armor or Raging Spirits, and it really comes down to, you know, how survivable you are. Are enemies getting through your spells and to you? If so, Arctic Armor might be a better choice for you because it'll just basically freeze anything that gets right up next to you, allowing you to finish it off without taking damage. And also whether or not you're using fire spells regularly, because Raging Spirits doesn't work with anything that's not a fire spell. So if you have lots of fire skills in your rotation, then this would be an option to further increase your damage. And when it comes to Ascendency classes, you have a choice right now of either Stormweaver or Chronomancer. Stormweaver is probably the easier of the 2 for new players. It simply buffs elemental damage, energy shields, elemental resistance, and status effects. Well, Chronomancer grants powerful buffs like increased cast speed and chance not to consume cooldowns every so often, but they're not always like, it's kind of like a high risk, high reward playstyle where sometimes it's buffing you really a lot and other times it's doing nothing for you, whereas the Stormweaver is going to be doing something for you constantly, which is why I recommend it more for a new player. So that wraps up our video on the Sorceress class. I really enjoy this class. I think out of all the classes I've played, which is all of them now, I think it has the highest variety of rotation of skills and mixing and matching of skills together. So if you like, you know, pressing more than just a couple skills in order to do a lot of stuff on the screen, this might be a good class for you. On the other hand, if you like just pressing like 1 or 2 buttons, this might not be the one for you. As always, if you have further tips for other sorceresses out there, things I didn't mention in this video, please leave them in the comments. And if you have any questions yourself, please post them there and I will try and answer them as soon as I can.